Rain clung to the tall windows of Harrowley House like a listening thing, blurring the autumn gardens into watercolor shadows, while inside the great drawing room the air held its breath. Silk whispered as ladies leaned closer, fans stilled mid-flutter, and the fire crackled too loudly, as though even the flames sensed they were witnesses. At the center of the room stood the Duchess of Harrowley, spine straight, gloved hands folded with deliberate calm, her chin lifted not in defiance, but in exhausted dignity. Across from her, beneath the painted gaze of ancestral dukes, stood her husband, a man whose stillness had always been mistaken for coldness, though it was born of restraint rather than indifference. The words she spoke were precise, carefully chosen, and devastating in their politeness. She requested a formal separation, citing incompatibility of temperament and irreparable trust. No voice was raised. No accusation was uttered aloud. Yet the sentence struck the room, like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath, sharp because it was controlled. Murmurs rippled instantly, as predictable as a tide, and the Duchess felt them touch her back like fingers already shaping her into a story she did not recognize as her own. The Duke did not interrupt. He did not protest, nor did he defend himself with protestations of innocence that would have satisfied the audience assembled. His expression remained grave, his hands clasped behind him, the posture of a man trained since boyhood to master reaction before emotion. In that silence, society heard what it wished. His reserve became confirmation. His dignity became distance. The Duchess's proud composure, maintained with such effort, was reinterpreted as arrogance, even cruelty, by those who had never known the cost of restraint. She remembered, in that moment, how differently it had all begun. A marriage forged less by affection than by mutual expectation, yet not without its fragile hopes. He had been attentive in quiet ways, remembering her preferences, ensuring her comfort without display. She had mistaken his gentleness for formality, his respect for disinterest, and her own longing for reassurance had gone unanswered not through neglect, but through misunderstanding. Now, standing before him with the room leaning toward her downfall, she wondered if silence had undone them both. When the formalities concluded, it was decided with brisk efficiency that she would leave the estate within the week. Papers would be prepared. Terms would be discreet. Discretion, she understood, was the final courtesy afforded to her, though it offered no protection from judgment. As the gathering dissolved into clusters of whispered opinion, she turned away without seeking her husband's eyes, fearing that if she met his gaze, resolve would falter and truth would rush out in a torrent she could no longer contain. That night, alone in her chamber, the Duchess pressed her palms against her abdomen as a sudden wave of dizziness overtook her. It had been a strange, persistent sensation for days, one she had dismissed as strain. Now, as realization settled with quiet certainty, her breath caught. The truth revealed itself not with drama, but with inevitability. She was with child. The heir everyone believed would never come had already begun, unseen and unclaimed, within her. She sat for a long while in the half-light, listening to the wind move through the trees beyond the window, understanding with aching clarity what this knowledge demanded of her. To speak now would be to invite accusations of manipulation, to bind an innocent life to scandal, to beg for belief from a world that had already decided her character. Pride rose to meet fear, and together they formed resolve. She would go as planned. She would protect what she carried with silence if silence was the only shield left to her. At dawn, her carriage rolled away from Harrowley House beneath a sky the color of ash. Servants stood in solemn lines, eyes lowered, while the gates opened with a groan that sounded like farewell. From the steps, the Duke watched, unmoving, as the carriage disappeared down the long drive. He told himself that restraint was mercy, that allowing her departure without spectacle was the last service he could render. He did not know that with each turn of the wheels, something of himself was being taken beyond reach. By the time gossip bloomed fully across drawing rooms and dinner tables, the Duchess was already gone from their sight, receding into anonymity by choice rather than defeat. She carried no jewels of consequence, only a single ring she could not bring herself to leave behind. In London, whispers hardened into conclusions. In the countryside, rain fell softly on unnamed roads, and between them, Unseen by society and unknown to its father, a legacy of blood and truth continued to grow, patient, silent, and destined to return. Years passed with the steadiness of seasons, smoothing sharp memories without erasing them. In a modest stone house set among hedgerows and low hills, the former Duchess learned how anonymity could feel like both exile and refuge. She became Mrs. Gray to the villagers, a quiet widow with composed manners and thoughtful eyes, respected but never truly known. Within those walls she raised her son with deliberate care, teaching him letters by the window, patience by the hearth, and kindness through her own uncomplaining example. She spoke little of his father, yet shaped the boy's character as if guided by an unseen standard, one that prized duty, restraint, and truth above all display. The child grew quickly, his presence filling rooms with a gravity beyond his years. Neighbors remarked upon his bearing, the way he listened before speaking, the steady calm of his gaze. At times, watching him walk beside her through the fields, she felt a pang so sharp it stole her breath, for in his profile she saw the echo of a man who believed himself childless. Still, she kept her silence. Protection, she had learned, was often mistaken for pride, yet she would rather bear that burden than expose her son to whispers that could wound more deeply than poverty ever might. In London, the Duke of Heir lived amid stone and ceremony, his life marked by routine and obligation. He attended Parliament, managed estates, and fulfilled the visible duties of his rank with unimpeachable honor. Society regarded him as a man of principle, if somewhat remote, and mothers spoke his name with regret rather than hope. He never corrected the assumptions made about his past, accepting their judgments as the price of order. In quieter moments, when firelight softened the edges of long evenings, he sometimes wondered whether silence had been a virtue or a failing, though he rarely allowed the thought to linger. Fate, patient as ever, began its work through formal channels rather than sentiment. A county assembly was announced, grander than usual, held under the patronage of crown representatives touring the region. Attendance was not merely expected, but required of those with title and standing. When the invitation arrived at the small stone house, sealed and unmistakable, the woman who read it felt the old weight return to her chest. To refuse would be conspicuous. To attend would risk everything she had built. Yet she understood that dignity, once surrendered, could only be reclaimed by standing upright before the world. Preparation became an exercise in restraint. She selected a gown of sober elegance, neither fashionable nor severe, and instructed her son carefully on manners suited to public rooms. He listened with solemn attention, sensing importance without understanding its source. On the morning of departure, she paused at the threshold of their home, steadying herself before stepping into a carriage that felt far grander than any she had known in years. As the wheels turned toward the county town, she reminded herself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to yield to it. The evening of the assembly unfolded in lamplight and restrained splendor. Chandeliers scattered gold across polished floors, and music drifted through the hall like something remembered rather than heard. When the Duke entered, conversation shifted subtly, as though the room had adjusted its posture. He acknowledged acquaintances with practiced courtesy, his attention fixed forward until a familiar presence arrested him mid-step. Across the hall stood a woman whose poise he knew before he recognized her face, composed yet alert, altered by time but unmistakable. For a breathless instant, years collapsed into memory, and the carefully ordered present faltered. She felt his gaze before she met it. Their eyes held briefly, a meeting weighted with unspoken history, then parted as etiquette demanded. She guided her son forward, his small hand resting easily in hers, introducing him to the evening with calm assurance. The boy observed the surroundings with quiet interest, absorbing the grandeur without awe, his expression thoughtful rather than dazzled. When he turned, laughter rising from another quarter, the Duke saw him clearly for the first time and felt an inexplicable tightening in his chest. Whispers resumed, subtle but persistent, stirred by recognition and curiosity. Some noted the woman's return with faint surprise, others with renewed judgment. A glove slipped from her hand as she moved through the crowd, and before a servant could intervene, the Duke retrieved it, offering it back with a bow held a moment longer than courtesy required. His words were impeccably formal, yet something in his tone suggested memory rather than politeness. She thanked him with equal restraint, aware of the eyes trained upon them, aware too of the child watching closely. Later, as the assembly progressed, an heirloom watch was delivered to her seat without explanation, its engraving unmistakable. She recognized it instantly, a relic she had once admired in passing, never knowing he had noticed. The gesture unsettled her more than any open approach could have done. Across the hall, the Duke observed her reaction, confirmation settling slowly into suspicion. The boy, sensing a shift he could not name, looked between them with quiet curiosity, unaware that his very presence was eroding a carefully constructed past. As the night drew on, tension replaced music as the dominant current. Neither spoke openly, yet each movement felt deliberate, each glance weighted with consequence. When at last the Duchess prepared to depart, the Duke found himself compelled to speak, requesting a private word with the gravity of a man confronting more than memory. She hesitated only a moment before agreeing, her hand tightening around her son's. Somewhere between candlelight and shadow, truth pressed close, waiting for the door that might finally open. And in that pause, heavy with years of restraint and unanswered questions, both understood that whatever followed would demand courage greater than silence, and that the child standing between them was no longer a secret time could safely keep intact forever. The private room into which they withdrew was narrow and lined with portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow every restrained movement. Candlelight trembled along the walls, casting neither warmth nor judgment, merely illumination. The Duke closed the door himself, an action small yet charged, and for a moment neither spoke. Years of formality pressed between them, heavy as the silence that had once undone their marriage. At last he turned, his voice low and precise, asking the only question that could no longer be avoided, the question his reason had been shaping since the moment he saw the child's face. She did not answer at once. Her composure wavered, not in weakness, but in calculation, as though she weighed truth against consequence for the final time. When she spoke, her words were steady, each syllable placed with care. She told him of the morning after she left, of the certainty that came without drama, of the knowledge that revelation would have turned her dignity into spectacle. She did not accuse him of cruelty, only of distance, and admitted her own pride had been both armor and prison. The child, she said simply, was his. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression altered not by disbelief, but by recognition. Memory rearranged itself with startling speed, small details aligning into a pattern he could no longer deny. The boy's gravity, the familiar restraint, the quiet intelligence behind his gaze all struck him now with undeniable force. He felt neither anger nor triumph, only a profound sense of having failed at the one duty he had never known he possessed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of confession rather than command, acknowledging that silence, once mistaken for honor, had been his gravest error. They stood opposite one another, the space between them charged with truths long deferred. She did not weep, though her eyes glistened with restrained emotion, and he did not reach for her, though the impulse stirred with unfamiliar urgency. Instead, he asked what she intended now, understanding that the choice must be hers before it could be his. She answered that she sought no restoration for herself alone, only legitimacy for her son, a future unshadowed by whispers. Reputation, she had learned, was a fragile shield, but integrity endured. The decision he faced unfolded with merciless clarity. To acknowledge the child publicly would invite scrutiny, reopen old judgments, and place his own past conduct beneath an unforgiving lens. Yet denial would condemn an innocent life to permanent obscurity and render his titles hollow. He thought of the long years he had devoted to duty, believing restraint sufficient proof of worth, and recognized how incomplete that devotion had been. True honor, he realized, required presence, not distance, and courage more demanding than silence. The assembly reconvened in the great hall, unaware that its balance had already shifted. When the Duke entered with measured resolve, conversation stilled, sensing something irrevocable in his bearing. He requested attention with formal courtesy, his words chosen with care befitting both crown and conscience. He spoke of responsibility, of past misunderstandings, and of a truth that could no longer remain unspoken without dishonor. Then, with deliberate clarity, he acknowledged the child as his son, born of lawful marriage, deserving of name and protection. The reaction rippled outward in stunned quiet rather than uproar. Whispers faltered, replaced by the discomfort of witnessing moral certainty. Some faces hardened, others softened, yet none could deny the authority of his claim or the dignity with which it was delivered. The Duchess stood composed beside her son, her hand resting lightly upon his shoulder, offering no plea, only presence. In that moment, her strength required no defense, and her past choices stood revealed not as defiance, but as sacrifice. Later, away from the gaze of the assembled, the Duke knelt before the boy, meeting his eyes without condescension or command. He spoke to him as one speaks to an equal, promising guidance rather than possession, protection rather than control. The child listened gravely, absorbing the gravity of a future suddenly expanded, then offered a small, careful nod that carried trust without naivety. Watching them, the Duchess felt the long tension within her ease, not into certainty, but into possibility. When the Duke turned to her, his expression held neither apology nor expectation, only invitation. He asked not for forgiveness, but for time, acknowledging that trust, once broken, could not be reclaimed by declaration alone. She considered him in silence, measuring the man he was against the one she had left behind. At last, she inclined her head, granting neither absolution nor refusal, only the space in which something truer might yet be built. As the night drew toward its close, the hall resumed its measured rhythms, though nothing remained unchanged. Carriages departed beneath a sky newly cleared of cloud, carrying altered stories into the darkness. The Duke watched as the Duchess and her son stepped into their carriage, aware that his future now followed a path both uncertain and irrevocable. In the quiet that followed, he understood that love, like honor, demanded action beyond words, and that the life he had just claimed would one day ask more of him than acknowledgment alone. He remained at the window long after the carriage vanished, the echo of hooves lingering like a question. Duty would require explanations, letters, and meetings conducted beneath watchful eyes. Yet none of that troubled him as much as the private reckoning ahead. He would need to learn how to be present, how to speak when silence tempted him toward safety. Somewhere beyond the lamps, a woman and a child carried his name into the night, without yet sharing his home. The future stood open, not generous, not kind, but honest, and for the first time he felt equal to its demand. What remained uncertain was whether courage would endure beyond this night, or whether love would require sacrifices still unimagined, waiting patiently for dawn ahead together.